I said. The boardroom was colder than usual that morning. Maybe it was the air conditioning. Maybe it was the eyes that silently judged me the moment I walked in. I had been with this company for 12 long years. And in those years, I had given my soul, my mind, and my heart. I had built projects from scratch, secured patents worth millions, and led teams that turned ideas into empires. But none of that mattered now. The new CEO, Mark Reynolds, sat at the head of the table. He was young, ruthless, the kind of man who smiled at your face while sharpening a knife behind his back. I had seen it in his eyes weeks ago, but I refused to believe he would actually go this far. He cleared his throat, leaned forward, and with a voice that carried no emotion, announced, "Moved. Effective immediately. You're terminated." The room fell into silence. My colleagues froze, their pens still, their breaths caught. I could feel their pity, but none of them dared to speak. No one wanted to risk their own position. I closed the file in front of me. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. Instead, I felt a strange calmness wash over me. I looked at him, and I smiled. "Thank you," I said. The words echoed in that cold room, slicing through the silence like a blade. A few jaws dropped. One of the junior directors shifted uncomfortably. Mark smirked, thinking he had won, but he hadn't, because I knew something he didn't. Serious. What Mark didn't know was that I held the key to the company's future. For years, I had been working on a patent, a technology that could change the entire industry. And though it was developed under my leadership, the ownership wasn't tied to the company yet. Legally, it was still mine. I had kept the paperwork close, waiting for the right moment, and Mark had just handed me that moment on a silver platter. I stood up, collected my papers, and began walking toward the door. The room was still frozen, until one voice finally cut through. The legal director, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rachel, slammed her hand on the table and snapped. "Get a lawyer, now!" Gasps filled the room. Even Mark's smirk faltered. For the first time, he realized maybe this wasn't going to end the way he thought. But by then, I was already gone, confident. I walked out of that building with no regrets. Yes, I had lost my title. Yes, they thought they had humiliated me. But in reality, they had freed me to do what I should have done long ago. Take what I built and use it for myself. Because sometimes the greatest revenge is success moved. I walked out of that glass tower for the last time, the weight of 12 years behind me, and the fire of a new beginning in my chest. The city outside looked different that day. The streets were alive with noise, but inside me, silence reigned. Silence. And a plan forming like thunderclouds ready to break. Mark Reynolds thought he had ended me. What he didn't realize was that he had opened the door to my freedom. And with freedom came power. I didn't go home. Instead, I went straight to my lawyer's office. Jonathan Price had been my legal shield for years. And the look in his eyes when I placed the folder on his desk told me everything. "What is this?" he asked, flipping through the documents. "The patent," I replied. My voice was steady, but inside, my heart beat like a war drum. "The one I've been developing for years. They think they fired me and took everything. But this," I tapped the folder. "This is mine, and it's worth billions." Serious. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, stunned. "Do you realize what this means? With this patent, you don't just have leverage. You have the future in your hands." I nodded slowly. "Then let's make them regret ever crossing me." That night, I sat by my window, staring out at the city lights. Memories of the boardroom echoed in my mind. Mark's smug smile, the silence of my so-called colleagues, Rachel's sharp voice. They had written me off. They thought I was finished, but I wasn't finished. I was just getting started, determined. Within days, Jonathan and I set up meetings with major competitors. Every CEO, every investor, every hungry shark in the industry. wanted a piece of what I had. The whispers spread quickly. The patent everyone was waiting for, finally up for grabs. The first meeting was with Silver Tech Industries, our biggest rival. Their CEO, a cunning strategist named Evelyn Carter, greeted me with a smile that could slice steel. "I heard you've had an eventful week," she said, pouring me a glass of wine. I smiled politely. "You could say that. And I heard you're holding something valuable." I slid the folder across the table. She opened it, her eyes widening as she read. For the first time in years, I felt the upper hand shift back to me. "This," she whispered, "is revolutionary. With this, we could topple Reynolds' empire." "That's exactly what I intend," I replied, confident. The negotiation began. Numbers were thrown around, offers made, promises whispered. By the end of the night, I walked out with a contract that would make me wealthier than I had ever imagined. But more than the money, it was the satisfaction, the knowledge that Mark Reynolds would soon wake up to a nightmare of his own making. 12 days. That's all it took. 12 days from the moment he fired me to the moment I sold the patent for over $1 billion. And when the news broke, the industry shook. Headlines screamed across every business journal. Former executive strikes back. $1.2 billion. Patents sold to rival. CEO Mark Reynolds faces industry shock after costly mistake. The board that had once stayed silent was now in chaos. Investors were furious. Shareholders demanded answers. And Mark was cornered, satisfied. I didn't have to see his face to know what it looked like. That smug smirk replaced with panic, his empire trembling beneath him. He had thought firing me was his victory. But in truth, it was his undoing. And me, I was no longer bound by their rules, their politics, their betrayals. I was free, and freedom tasted sweeter than any title ever could. As I signed the final documents, Jonathan raised a glass to me. "To revenge," he said. I smiled. "No, to justice, because sometimes the greatest justice is letting your enemies drown in the consequences of their own arrogance." Sad. The morning after the headlines hit, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating non-stop. Dozens of messages, missed calls, and emails flooded my screen. Former colleagues who hadn't dared to defend me in the boardroom were suddenly desperate to reconnect. Investors who once ignored my ideas now wanted to collaborate. Hypocrisy was everywhere, but there was one call I knew would come. And it did. Mark Reynolds. His voice on the other end was strained, no longer dripping with arrogance, but heavy with desperation. "You've made your point," he said coldly, "but you don't know what you've done." Moved. I let his words hang in the air before replying. "What I've done, Mark, is reclaim what was always mine. You thought you could silence me, erase me, but now the entire world knows the truth. You fired the wrong person," he scoffed. "You think selling that patent makes you powerful. You've started a war you can't win." Serious. I smiled to myself. "Then I'll fight, because unlike you, I don't build empires on betrayal." And with that, I ended the call. For the first time, I realized Mark wasn't just angry. He was afraid, confident. Within days, Silver Tech launched their campaign with my patent at the center. The technology promised to reshape the industry, and investors flocked to them like moths to a flame. Stock prices soared. Meanwhile, Mark's company, once untouchable, began to crumble. News outlets dissected every detail of his decision to fire me. Analysts called it the greatest corporate blunder of the decade. Shareholders demanded his resignation, and the boardroom that had once sat in silence when I walked out was now filled with shouting, panic, and chaos. For me, it was justice, playing out in real time, satisfied. One evening, I received an anonymous tip. Mark had called an emergency meeting with the board. Curiosity tugged at me, so I arranged for someone on the inside to stream the session to me privately. There he was, standing at the head of the table, sweat visible on his brow, his once commanding voice cracking under the pressure. "You don't understand," he pleaded with them. "This was all part of my strategy. We can recover. We just need time." But the board wasn't buying it. One by one, they turned on him. "You fired the architect of the patent that could have saved us. You destroyed shareholder trust. You've turned us into a laughingstock." By the end of the meeting, a vote was cast. Mark Reynolds, once the untouchable CEO, was stripped of his title. Moved, when I heard the news, I felt no joy, only closure. His downfall wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about proving a truth. Arrogance and betrayal eventually destroy themselves. Later that night, as I walked through the quiet streets of the city, I thought about the journey, from being humiliated in front of the entire board to standing on the edge of building something entirely new. The world had shifted. I wasn't just someone who had been wronged. I was someone who had risen. Hopeful. The calls from investors didn't stop. Every major firm wanted to back me now. But I realized something important. I didn't want to just sell patents. I wanted to build, not for titles, not for revenge, but for the vision I had carried all along, the vision they had once dismissed. So I began laying the foundation of my own company, a place where innovation thrived, where betrayal had no seat at the table, where silence in the face of injustice would never be tolerated. And when the first building block of that dream was set, I raised my glass, whispering to myself, "This isn't the end. This is the beginning," because sometimes, soft the best revenge is living a life so powerful, so unshakable, that your enemies can do nothing but watch. Sad weeks passed, and while Mark's empire crumbled, mine was quietly rising. But success never comes without shadows. The more I built, the more I realized, betrayal doesn't just come from the boardrooms of corporations. It sometimes comes from those closest to you. One late evening, as I was reviewing blueprints in my office, my assistant entered nervously. "There's someone here to see you," she whispered. "Who?" I asked. "Someone from your past." Before I could reply, the door opened and in walked Daniel, my former colleague, the man who had once been my closest ally before he sold me out to Mark for a promotion. Angry. "Why are you here?" I asked coldly. He looked older, broken, his once polished suit now worn, his confidence shattered. "I made a mistake," he admitted. I thought siding with Mark was the smart move. But when he fell, he took me down with him. I lost everything. I wanted to shout at him, to remind him how he had betrayed me when I needed him most. But instead, I stayed silent. His guilt was punishment enough. Moved. He continued, "I heard about your new company. You're building something big, something real. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'd like a chance to make things right. Let me help you." The room was quiet, the weight of history pressing between us. I remembered the night he had turned his back on me, the sting of betrayal. But I also remembered who I was. Not someone who held grudges, but someone who rebuilt from ashes. "You want redemption?" I asked. He nodded. "Then earn it. Not with words, but with actions. If you stand with me now, there's no turning back. Loyalty isn't optional. It's everything." His eyes met mine, filled with regret, but also determination. For the first time, I saw sincerity, serious. As the weeks went by, Daniel worked tirelessly at my side. He connected me with investors, streamlined negotiations, and even helped me secure a team of innovators who shared my vision. Slowly, trust began to form again. Not blind trust, but cautious, deliberate trust. But success doesn't go unnoticed. One evening, as I left my office, I found an envelope slipped under my car windshield. Inside was a single piece of paper with the words, "You may have won the battle, but the war isn't over. Watch your back." No signature, no explanation. But I knew it was from Mark, nervous. Even though he had lost his position, Mark wasn't finished. Men like him never walk away quietly. They lurk in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. I tightened security, doubled my precautions, and warned my team. We build, but we build carefully. Every step forward must be guarded. Still, a part of me wasn't afraid, because I had learned something. Fear loses its grip the moment you decide to fight for yourself. Hopeful. Months later, the first product of my new company launched, a breakthrough device that transformed industries overnight. The world responded with awe. Orders flooded in, partnerships solidified, and for the first time, I felt unstoppable. Standing on the stage at the global conference, looking out at thousands of people cheering for innovation, I realized something profound. My story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about resilience. It was about proving that no betrayal, no humiliation, no loss could silence the voice of someone who refuses to give up. Soft. And as the applause thundered, I whispered inside, to anyone who's ever been betrayed, humiliated, or cast aside, remember this: you are not finished. Your story is still being written, and the ending is yours to decide, because sometimes the greatest power is not in destroying your enemies, but in becoming so unshakable, so undeniable, that they can never destroy you again. Sad. The night after my company's first global launch, I sat alone in my office. The world saw the lights, the cameras, the success, but they didn't see the scars behind it. Every triumph carried the memory of betrayal. Every celebration reminded me of the nights I thought I would never rise again. But as I looked at the glowing skyline through my office window, I realized I was no longer the person who had once been humiliated and cast out. I had become something stronger, moved. The next morning, I received a letter, not an email, a physical letter. The handwriting was familiar. My heart froze for a moment. It was from my late father. Inside was a note he had written years ago, but never gave me. Success will tempt you to hate those who wronged you. But real strength is not revenge. It is to keep building even when the world tries to break you. I sat there, silent, as his words sank deep into my soul. All this time, I thought I was fighting for revenge. But, in reality, I was carrying his legacy. His belief that integrity is the greatest wealth of all. Serious. That very week, rumors began to spread. Mark was planning a comeback. He had aligned with a foreign corporation notorious for hostile takeovers. Their mission was clear: crush my company before it became too powerful. My board members panicked. Investors grew anxious. Even Daniel, who had stood faithfully by my side, asked quietly, "Can we withstand this?" I didn't answer immediately. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. Then, I turned back to him. We've come too far to fear shadows. We fight not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. If we survive this storm, no one will ever question us again. Angry. And so, the war began. Mark unleashed everything he had: lawsuits, smear campaigns, fabricated scandals. News outlets ran stories questioning my leadership. Anonymous threats filled my inbox. But unlike before, I wasn't alone. My team stood united. Daniel defended me in courtrooms. Investors rallied behind our vision. And customers, millions of them, kept buying, kept believing. For every lie Mark spread, we answered with truth. For every obstacle he built, we tore it down with innovation. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Hopeful, 1 year later, my company wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. We had expanded into multiple industries, our technology setting new global standards. And Mark, he was nothing more than a whisper in the past, a warning of what happens when greed tries to crush resilience. But the greatest victory wasn't the money, or the recognition, or even the success. It was walking back into the same boardroom where I had once been humiliated, this time not as a victim, but as a leader. The silence was the same, but this time it wasn't the silence of betrayal. It was the silence of respect. Moved, as I stood before them, I thought of every person who had ever been betrayed, every dream that had been stolen, every voice that had been silenced. And I spoke, not just for myself, but for all of them. You can steal my job. You can steal my title. You can even steal my dignity for a moment. But you will never steal my will to rise again. Because power doesn't belong to those who betray. It belongs to those who endure. The room erupted in applause, not out of pity, but out of recognition. Recognition that the story they had once tried to erase had now become a story the world couldn't ignore. Soft outro. So if you are listening to this right now, and you've been broken, betrayed, or abandoned, remember this: your story is not over. Pain is temporary. Betrayal is temporary. But the strength you find in the ashes, that will last forever. Because sometimes the sweetest revenge is not revenge at all. It's becoming everything they said you could never be. Soft pause. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind you, no betrayal can silence the truth.